Really nice to see you both, and to see you in your yurt. So that's very heartwarming. So I'd like to introduce Isa Fremeaux and JJ. Um, and I thought maybe it's best if you introduce yourselves because you have so many different heads. So yeah, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, so thank you very much for hosting this conversation. My name is Isa, and I am an educator and an activist, and I am the co-founder with Jay of the Laboratory of Insurrectional Imagination. And for since 2004, we've basically been bringing artists and activists together to co-design, co-devise, and deploy um, new ways of resisting and disobeying in many different contexts. And I am personally in the lab and in many other contexts passionate about popular education and collective dynamics and group dynamics. I am quite passionate about facilitation as well. That's what I do.
And I'm Jay, and I suppose I approached the lab with an artist activist hat on. I was trained first in theatre, but I found theatre was too deadening. I was always searching for really to merge art and life, and theatre was too much text. And then I discovered performance art, felt a bit more alive, and then actually realized that performance was, all the performance art world that I was working in was always saying the same things, the same people. And then I discovered direct action, which is simply the act of putting your body in the way of a machine rather than writing to your MP or lobbying for something, that actually making the change directly. And I discovered that in the anti-Rose movement. And that led me into realizing that for me, that was a kind of performance practice, and led me into really spending the rest of my life, that was in the 90s, spending the rest of my life applying creativity to social movements. So working within climate justice movements, anti-capitalist movements, after globalization movements, and applying creativity to create new forms of resistance. And that led in 2004 to Isa and I meeting, setting up the lab, and doing that since then.
Great.
Maybe one of the things that I'd like to add about the lab is that I think that one of the dimensions that we've been trying to really deploy is to have this resistance and disobedience with joy, and to do it with humor, very often taking the struggle against social and climate injustice very seriously without taking ourselves seriously, and trying to really do it in ways that make resistance joyful and a space of togetherness.
That's great. Thank you. I'd like to say that we met through Futures Ventures, and that's a foundation that supports artists working radically. So I had the pleasure of spending 8 weeks with you over Zoom. And at the start of those workshops, something kind of quite magical happened, and that was that I received a letter in the post. And it was a great letter because I've not really ever had a letter like that before. And in it there was some leaves. I can't remember what they were. Yarrow, was it?
Oh no, it was yarrow. It was yarrow, wasn't they? It was yarrow. Achilles, yeah.
And they were from your hedgerows where you live locally. And at one point we all boiled the kettle, didn't we? And we made tea and we drank tea together. Although you were in France and I was in London and other people were in Hull and all over the UK. But in this letter, there was a map and instructions and coordinates of where I could find you if I was to be in the area. And the instructions were to follow the water and to go upriver. It was the River Erd or the Loire, and to find 9 tributaries and to trace any of them to its source, and that arriving on a thin backbone of clay that rises between the watersheds and in the midst of a labyrinth of hedgerows, that I would arrive at a place from which you write, and the place that you say has transformed you, and the place that has become you. And this is the ZAD, which is the zone to defend. I wondered if you could talk about this place.
Okay. So, yeah, well, we're speaking to you from this yurt in a collective. So we live with 10 people on this, in one collective that's one amongst 40 different collectives on 4,000 acres of land. And right here, from this yurt, under this yurt, is some land that actually, if there hadn't been direct action and disobedience and free figurative forms of creative politics, we'd be on the runway of an international airport. And so what happened, there was a project for an airport for these lands. They're wetlands, farmlands and forests with 222 kilometers of hedgerows. And they wanted to turn it into another monoculture, another airport with the same coffee machines, the same coffee places, the same, just reduce everything that was complex and relational and pluriversal on this land into another monocultural machine, a climate wrecking machine, and an international airport. And so from the 70s, there was a resistance by farmers against it, mostly to say we want nourishing land, not the spread of the urban spread here, because we're 20 minutes from the city of Nantes. And then in the 2000s, everything changed. There was the first ever climate camp happened here, which was inspired by the climate camp in the UK, which we were part of organizing. And during that climate camp here, inhabitants read out a letter which basically invited people to come and squat the land against the airport, because they said to defend a territory, you need to inhabit it. And that's what happened. The climate camp started to fold its tents down and people started to live here.
Yeah, because maybe what is important to understand is like when these big projects happen, what happens is that the governments and the multinationals that they work with buy land and farmhouses to empty them and gut the territory out of any kind of resistance. So the local residents really witnessed that and realized that they needed to be inhabitants to defend it. And what happened is that when people started coming to live here and started to make links with farmers, started to learn to farm, which obviously the government didn't see with a very in a very positive way. And so in 2012, they organized a first military operation to evict squatters. It was called Operation Caesar, and in the land of Asterix, which was first strategic mistake. And the resistance that they faced was so diverse and so determined that it took everyone by surprise. And it really came to light a month after the beginning of the eviction operation, where people had put a call out to say, if they evict us, we'll come back. And so they did. They organized a really big demonstration a month after the beginning of the operation, to which 40,000 people came and rebuilt in one weekend an entire hamlet, because the military operation had destroyed 12 farmhouses and cabins. And so during that huge demonstration, an entire hamlet was built in one weekend. And the Cops came back a few days later, tried to attack it, not realizing that when so many people have put so much energy into a rebuilding gesture, they're going to be very motivated to defend it. And so they defended even more. And the government realized that they would have to kill someone if they wanted to go to the full extent of their operation. And so they withdrew. And after a few months of having a rather symbolic occupation, they withdrew completely. And for 6 years, there was no police or state institution setting foot on this entire zone, where up to 400 people lived full-time, 70 collectives, and a flurry of activities that were basically rebuilding the commons. So there were loads and loads of agricultural activities, but also a lot of craft, a lot of cultural activities, a radio, a rap studio, a library, a local newsletter, and that was this. It was basically where we discovered what it means in the everyday to resist and build in the same gesture, which is something that we had been looking for a long time, because we set up the lab when we were still based in London, and we were involved in many social movements, maybe big mobilizations against the G8, against the UN conference on climate change, and deploying really interesting experiments in disobedience and resistance, but always feeling that these were quite ephemeral, and that every time we would go back home, go back to our jobs, go back to our mortgage, and basically go back to reproducing the capitalism that we were fighting very determinedly in these social movements. And when we arrived here, because we had decided to leave London after a European trip that we did in 2008, searching and documenting other ways of living in utopian ways, as we called it. We got convinced during that trip that we wanted to move out of London. So we moved out of London, discovered the ZAD, and then totally fell in love with this territory that really taught us what it's like to live and resist in the everyday, in the same gesture always. And to finish quickly on the story of the ZAD, there were these 6 years without cops and state institutions, and where the resistance was still very active. And in 2018, the government cancelled the airport project, and said that the airport would not take place, but that all the people living here would need to leave. Sorry, I'm just gonna.
Oh, no problem.
And so in April, they came and organized another big military operation to evict people, and forced, to make it very brief, forced us to enter a process of legalization, which some of us, a lot of people refused and left, and some of us, and a lot of us, hacked in order to be able to stay, because the relationships that had been built here between us and the bocage, which is the name of the landscape here, the humans, the modern humans, and the territory, were too strong to give it back to a state that would have never taken care of it the way we did. And so we are here still fighting to build, to slowly build the commons.
And it was an act of revenge. I mean, I think what's very clear, I mean, when they came with, tanks and drones and helicopters and destroyed 40 different cabins after we'd won against the airport, it was a way of saying, one, you're not really meant to win. And two, it's really not okay to live as if you were free without the state. As our friend David Graeber used to say, he said, you know, you can do demonstrations, you can go on strike, do all these things, but if you show governments that they're useless and you don't really need them and that you can live without them, then they get really annoyed. And that's kind of what happened in what was the biggest police mobilization since May 68 at the time, against us, because we'd actually shown that it was possible. And that's been always the basis of our art activism, has always been this idea of prefigurative politics. Always, you know, show the world that you want whilst fighting it at the same time.
So I saw you both talking at Toynbee Hall about the ZAD, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but you were talking, it's not just about resistance, it's about sort of prefiguring possibility. I thought that was really important. I wondered if you could talk more about that, about imagining better futures, I suppose.
I mean, I think it's, you know, the capitalist system is very, very good at limiting our sense of potential. I mean, one thing it does is it makes us, you know, it makes us forget, forces a story that makes us forget that most of progress, most of history is constructed through disobedience. That actually the right to wear trousers as women, the right to have a weekend, the right to have 8-hour day work, all those things, even the right to vote, came because people disobeyed, people broke laws. So that's one of the storytellings that the system does. But the other storytelling is that this is it, this is capitalism, and there's no other way of living. There's no other possibilities of life and potentials. And for us, you know, what works is when what can be very powerful. And I think I learned that when I in the late 90s in Reclaim Streets, I learned that actually the best form of resistance was actually to show other ways of living in the now, to not wait for some kind of revolutionary moment, but actually to show the world that you want now, and that being an act of resistance. So in Reclaim Streets, we would, you know, the idea was that the streets were the commons, they were privatized by the car. So instead of doing demonstrations to say no cars, we would actually create streets with dancing bodies and rave sound systems and have tens of thousands of people dancing and on a motorway, showing that actually this was what a street should be like, rather than having cars. So it's really this idea of living now as if you were free and not waiting, and showing that,
showing it and experiencing it. Because I think that that's also one of the issues with resistance movements that are only in the know, is that you very quickly become exhausted and brittle and full of despair, because you know what it is that you are fighting against, and it's really important and it's totally legitimate, and there is a lot of dignity in fighting. But if you never experience the joy and the beauty of the world you want, then you exhaust yourself. And I think that this is what is so important in having the yes and the no. The prefigurative politics is also about experiencing.
And for us, but you know, activism is a battle of the imagination. One of the beautiful examples here is, for example, in 2014, there was a long process between this huge diversity. So you've got anarchists and farmers and locals and trade unionists and runaway hippies and libertarian communists. You've got all sorts of different folk coming together and writing this document, which was called "Because There Will Not Be an Airport, These Are the 6 Points for the Future of the ZAD." And that is a very interesting battle of the imagination thing, because instead of saying, you know, we don't want an airport, no to the airport, the document said, because there won't be an airport, this is in 2014, the airport is cancelled in 2018. Because there won't be an airport, this is the vision of the future that we will have for this land. We will live as their commons, we will keep the diversity of forms of life, etc. and that is really about hacking and bending the story, because the government story was, this is the land, we've made a little circle around this land, these 4,000 acres, and this is where we're going to put the airport. And we're like, no, there's not going to be an airport. And when that kind of imagination works, you spread it, and people believe it, and then it happens. So for us, there's very little division between art, activism, and magic, in a way, in that they're all forms of battles of the imagination.
And I think that the magic of it was that it was not imagination that is uprooted, that is detached from experience and from land and from everyday. It was not imagination that is somehow boxed out in a special place for the imagination, like often art places can be. Is that here it was imagination coming out of the land, from the everyday and the everyday life and the everyday resistance of people. And what we witnessed here is how much hope that gives to people. It's not just telling a story that is full of beautiful imagination, which I believe is really important. But here there was the example of people living it every day, and I think that it gave a texture to the hope that it provided to people here. That was extraordinary.
And we're speaking, for example, just I can see over there, we built a lighthouse where they wanted to put the control tower, and that again is just doing an act of resistance, but which is also just hits the imagination in the right place, and using archetypes, and so instead of a control tower, we wanted something that gave hope to people, that showed the way to people if they were lost, and yeah, so it's really and also to shift the imagination of the ZAD, because a lot of people imagined this place as a protest camp, and it wasn't a protest camp. It was much more than that. It was, we were building medieval barns that will last 1,000 years, and huge cabins and lighthouses, and it was also a way of shifting that imagination within the activist world and the media world, of where they were like, it's a protest camp, it's precarious, it's going to disappear like all the protest camps, and we'll build an airport. And we're like, no, we're going to build big things, solid things, and we're going to be here for 1,000 years, or they're going to be here for 1,000 years, and there'll never be an airport. So it's materializing the imagination.
There's a word you use which I love, and I don't hear it very often, and it's I think same thing, bocage. And I came across this word in research quite a few years ago, and I was looking at Staffordshire figurines, and they were kind of made in the 18th century, and they were for working class people, and they were kind of you collected them, and they were given away at fairs and all kinds of places. But very often they would have like a little pastoral scene of donkey, a man driving his donkey, or sort of lovers in hedgerows. But there would be this sort of greenery in the background, and that is bocage. And they were made for people that were leaving, being uprooted from their land. Basically, it was in that sort of industrial land grab, and that when people were losing the commons. So I guess they were made for people that were homesick. So I kind of often sort of think about, particularly myself, someone who's very urban. I live in a city, and my sort of my disconnect that I have, and a lot of other people have, with their lives in nature, and so I kind of find it very interesting that you sort of talk about your hedgerows and your existence there, sort of everyday living with nature. And something on the workshops that you encouraged us to do, which was to just to sit, and to the sit spot, and that sort of even for a minute, but just to sort of slowly sort of build up this relationship of just looking and listening and observing kind of what was going on around. I wonder if you would talk about that.
I mean, I think that for me, one of the, because I lived 20 years in London, so in a very, very, tunnel vision, disconnected
Exactly.
way from the more than human. I mean, the metropolis is conceived that way. It's really conceived as this space where humans only relate to themselves. So there is no connection to anything that is more than human in the metropolis. And one of the things that I've discovered here, I was, it's not really discovered, is that you actually learn it, you experience it, is this idea that is very basic, that when you inhabit a place, really it ends up inhabiting you. And I think that what is the extraordinary emotion here is this idea that we have taken care of the bocage and we kind of saved it from destruction because this bocage takes care of us so much. And this relationship of reciprocity that you cannot have, in my view, in a very, very urban environment. You don't have a sense of reciprocity with concrete and tarmac, and it's that you do have it here when you actually go through the same bit of forest to go to see your neighbors, and you know that in that same forest people have had built tree houses to defend the forest, and they were taken down by cops and they were resisting, and there was that sense of and you go through that forest and that if it hadn't been for the struggle, this would be an airport, it would be a runway. And that gives a sense of deep preciousness to it, and that really is in the relationship that is very unique in my view. And I think that is also knowing that we are trying, like, slowly and very often painfully, but we're trying to rebuild the commons here. So we're trying to rebuild that sense of taking care of the territory together, not managing it, but really taking care of it. So and I think that it's a really interesting relationship as well. Maybe if you want to say something.
There's a 2-year-old knocking at our door. I'm just gonna maybe this is the moment to shift.
Sorry about that.
Don't worry. It's interesting you're sort of saying taking care of rather than managing. So that's very subtle changing language, isn't it? Sort of managing being
it's a relationship between, it's the difference between apprehending the territory as resources or as the thing that you take care of and takes care of you. For me, it's really a relationship of care, not a relationship of exploiting resources. And that is all the difference. And I think that sometimes the commons are being talked about as a kind of collective management of resources, and that's not really a definition that I think is one that we're interested in here. That it's very important for us here to think of this place as being part of us, and not as resources.
I think that's the problem though, sort of generally everything is treated as a resource, and that sort of duty of care and acceptance of vulnerability, that if it's not resourceful, then it's useless and it's not valued. And yes, indeed. Jay, I'm glad you mentioned the lighthouse. You must have, it must have taken a lot of people to raise it.
Well, we often talk about a culture of resistance, which for us is this idea that most people are not psychologically or physically ready to be on the front line of any resistance, So, in 2012, when there was the first evictions here, you would have local villagers shouting at the police. You'd have people up in the tree houses. You'd have people throwing Molotov cocktails. You'd have tractors blocking the roads and everything. And there were people on the front line, very diverse people on the front line, but most people can't do that. But those people absolutely need a culture of care behind them. So they need people doing the food, bringing dry socks because this is a wetland, very muddy. They need people doing the legal work. They need people doing the childcare. They need all that. There used to be a banner on the ZAD that said, "Pas de barricadière sans cuisinier," which means no women on the barricade without men in the kitchen. And it kind of sums up this idea of that all resistances need a front line. They need that resistance. They need that conflict. But that doesn't exist without this huge network of care. And that network here involves so many different kinds of people. And one person who was against the airport was a welder. And so in cultures of resistance, you bring your everyday jobs to the resistance. He was a welder. He was welding the world's biggest cruise ship in Saint-Nazaire shipmaking place, which is like 40 minutes away. And in the weekends, he was coming here and helping us build this huge lighthouse, which is 20 meters high and works and has a light that turns around, made out of an old electricity pylon. And to raise it, we were also using, farmers that love to move big things with their big machines. So we were using all these kind of, machines with names I don't know in English, to lift the thing. And it took 5 months of work, but also all the workshops, all the kind of work sites we have here, we always try and make them what we call chantier école, so school work sites. So basically, yes, there's the kind of production, and here we were building this thing whilst in Parliament every week, the government saying, we're coming in October, we're coming to build the airport. So we were building it thinking it may well be destroyed within a month, or 2 months or 3 months or whatever. And I lost my thread. What was the thread, farmer?
The schools.
Oh, schools, sorry. So we were building it and there was the deadline, but actually the important thing is actually to do skill share. So people were also learning to work metal and to do welding as well. And that's super important as part of the process on the ZAD. And the lighthouse itself became a bit of a symbol for the victory, because on the day of the victory, it was on all the TV stations. People had at the top of the lighthouse put a big banner which said "Etok," which kind of means gotcha. And that banner on the lighthouse was behind the Prime Minister when he was on the news, the evening news, and the big thing. So Prime Minister with gotcha. And Macron was very, very angry. And actually, when he came for the revenge attacks in April 2018, wanted to destroy the lighthouse, but it's still there. So.
Very good. It's interesting what you say about people not wanting to be on the front line. So that sort of idea that it's like living in the wrong society, or things need sort of shaping up and changing, and I feel a lot of people sort of feel that way, but they don't want to be on the front line. So as people who are you're constantly defending your way of life and other people's way of life and the Bocage's way of life, I wonder, probably a difficult question, but what people can do just in their everyday lives just to resist without being on the front line. just little things that can be done differently?
I mean, I think it's, for me, there is organizing, and that when organizing for me means getting out of the idea that well, there is nothing I can do. And it's like, no, of course, by yourself, there is very little you can do. But when you join up and you start organizing with other people, then a momentum can be built up, and every single fight that has won started as a minority cause that sounded ludicrous at once. And I think it's really important to remember that everything we take for granted, as JJ listed, from the right women to wear transits to the abolition of slavery, when it first came out, it sounded ludicrous and absurd. And I think that it's important to build up the momentum, and to think, well, instead of thinking, well, I can't do anything, it's much more to say, well, what is it that I know to do that I can bring to a fight? And if it's, if you're a lawyer, then give your advice for free. If what you know how to do is to cook, then go and cook for, community meetings, go and cook for resistance camps, join the fights where it is, and join social movements, because there are social movements everywhere. And I think that one of the things it's to be able to join up these struggles, to be able to reinvent also new ways of doing things. But I think that the first step is to go beyond the individualistic mentality that is imposed upon us, because I think that society is screaming at us all the time, you're on your own and there's nothing you can do. And history shows that it's simply not true. It's that there's quite a lot of there are quite a lot of fights that have been lost, but there are also a lot of fights that have been won, and quite a lot that were not meant to win. It's like, for a long time here, like defeating an airport project when you had a military operation and the government that says we're going to do it, and it's coupled with one of the biggest multinationals in the world. That's it seems on paper that there's nothing you can do, and actually this extraordinary fight here showed that it is possible. And I think that it is possible because everyone here just thought, okay, what is it that I can do? And sometimes it was as simple as people saying, well, I live nearby and I have a garage, and if you get evicted, you can put your stuff in my garage. And that can seem small, but this is why we talk about a culture of resistance. When you actually are here and you are threatened with eviction, knowing that that exists gives you a lot of strength and courage, and that courage is contagious. And I think that's also that, is that how can you actually give yourself and each other courage and hope?
And courage obviously comes from the French cœur, meaning heart, meaning speaking with your heart, literally. And I think the other thing is actually exactly that, feel alive in what you do. I mean, I think so many people end up wanting to do something political, end up working in NGOs, spending their life on Zoom, in bureaucracies, trying to change the world, and ending up in kind of just pure abstraction and not really feeling alive anymore. And I think the key is, do something that makes you feel alive whilst you're resisting, not something that you feels that you're doing it because it's the right thing to do, but actually that it's the thing that makes you feel most alive, because you can often do the thing that you think's right for you and you don't feel alive, and then you're not very good at doing it.
And I think that it's also finding the balance between lying to yourself, thinking that the tiny gestures are enough, I cycle to work and I sort out my waste. So, you know, I'm doing what I can. I'm doing my little gesture. Is that I think that these little gestures are necessary, but they are so much the basics that they should not be part of, you know, thinking that's part of the struggle. But we also meet so many people who kind of diffuse any kind of energy in themselves by saying, yeah, but you know, we can't change everything. And because we can't change everything, then we might as well not start. And I think that that's also something that needs to be unplugged. There's most of this way of thinking is that actually the fight needs to be fueled every day. And no, you're not going to bring down capitalism in one fight, in one go. It's like, but this is not how it works. And I think that it's also rediscovering the joy of resisting. And I think that it's this obsession with result. We want gratification. We want to see the result. And if I don't see the result, then it's pointless. And I'm absolutely convinced that it's not. It's never pointless. And I think that it's really necessary to remember that we are all the descendants of people who have been leading incredible fights in a cumulative way.
Thank you. I think a last question, and you're kind of a beacon because you're connected to other resistances globally. So I know sort of people have been watching what's happening at the ZAD and you know all the works that you've done to kind of you know to defend it. So you're kind of connected to this sort of global network of people who are currently resisting, and it's probably a difficult question, but I wonder what do you think the most pressing fights are at the moment?
I mean, I think again that's one thing I think that I've learned from ecology is be situated, you know. So I mean, if you ask this question and you're talking to someone who's right now in Mariupol, well, they're going to have a completely different answer. It's people in Syria who are going to completely different answer. The people in the favelas of Brazil that are being attacked by the state, they're completely different from people in Greenland who are fighting against an airport, who are completely different from people in Papua New Guinea who are trying to reclaim their land. So, I mean, I think it comes back to this kind of way of thinking that is so much part of the modern, which is this kind of very uprooted, disconnected, universal, global thinking. And I think what we're trying to do with our art and our activism is trying to say, re-anchor all these things into a situated context, into where you live. And so the question would be, well, what is the most important struggle right now, here, in my neighborhood, or in my region, or, you know, which may be linked to a global thing of, you know, Black Lives Matters, or rise of radical new wave of radical feminism, or climate justice. But it won't have any sense unless it's really anchored. And I think one of the reasons we left the city and the metropolis was because the metropolis is this monoculture machine that this anchors us, that makes us float. So you know, we often felt that, you know, in the art world, you know, basically you do really well in terms of your career if you can show you've had exhibitions in Buenos Aires, in Dubai, in Mumbai, in St. Petersburg or whatever. And then, but if you say, oh, I've lived in the same local village all my life and all my work has been about creating new forms of relations between the human and non-human, or between humans in that village, then your art career is fucked, because hypermobility is more important and more valuable in capitalism than actually being able to get to know your community. And it's not to say you know, our big inspiration are the Zapatistas, who managed to kind of have this very local anchored form of resistance, whilst at the same time being completely globally connected and having global solidarity. Because the danger is, you know, of course, that fascism is trying to push us down into this rooted land, you know, local anti-global kind of image, and it's not. I think it's perfectly possible to have a form of local practice which isn't falling into those traps of kind of neo-fascism and blood and land and roots and so on. So yeah, so that's a long way of saying, you know, answer to the question, or maybe the question is what is the interesting fight where I live? What is the struggles? What are the issues? Where can I put my creativity and my care?
And I think it's also that for me there is no hierarchy possible between struggles. It's like, who is to say that it's more important or more urgent to fight on climate change, climate justice, or migrant rights? It's like the two are connected, and if you try to make this kind of hierarchy, you just lose your mind, because it's impossible morally. You find yourself in an impasse, and the thing that actually is when you realize that all these issues are interconnected anyway, that it's that the forced migrations are due to wars, and the wars are very much linked to resource wars, and resource wars are very connected to the fossil industry that is bringing climate chaos, that is actually, you know, pushing people off their land, etc., etc. And I think that sometimes it's also, it's, you know, what is the situatedness is also about what is there, and if what is there is also people who are, you know, undocumented and really struggling, and what you can do is to help them find dignity in your city, then that's great. And if what brings you is actually go and build a local garden, and to be able to fight against the, you know, implantation of a supermarket, then go and do that. It's also about, you know, it's the situatedness, and it's where your energy is going to take you, so that it makes sense to you and you can find the joy. I think it's not necessarily a purely rational thing, because really for me fight is life, and life is also about, you know, what gives you joy, what takes your heart, what, you know, makes you jump out of bed in the morning. Is not, it's not just a rational process of analysis of the world. Is that the rational process of analysis of the world comes into it, but I don't think that it's necessarily the root of it.
And I think a lot of our work has always been about resisting the kind of rationalness in the left, which is like, you know, if only you can communicate enough, you know, we just need to communicate, tell people, you know, how many different species have died in one day, 200 species are pushed to extinction, or how many children have died of hunger today, or, you know, the facts and the figures will actually motivate people. And actually we're quite convinced that actually that's not what wins. I mean, clearly, okay, that people know these things doesn't lead them to action. What actually leads people to action, and capitalism understands this much better than the left, is fantasy. And actually, you know, that actually, you know, we have to create, and this comes back to this idea of prefigurative worlds and imagination. We have to actually bring people into movements through fantasy. What do you fantasize about? What is your passion? Not, you know, how many migrants died in the Mediterranean today, because people know that stuff. And so, yeah, so I think the role of the artist is very much in social movements is to bring those aspects, to bring that kind of fire of imagination and fantasy into social movements, and to resist this kind of well, if people knew, they would act.
In the places where the propaganda is not pushed to such an extreme, then it's, I think that the situation in Russia is kind of showing that sometimes facts, like putting out the right facts, are also is also a fight. But generally, I think that I think that there's is very much about giving people, and it's also to not act on guilt. That for me is really what is important, is like the guilt-ridden, angsty leftist is often not someone who's going to give themselves nor other people a lot of joy. It's like, you have, there is guilt, we know it. It's like, we live in a profoundly unjust system where a very small minority is responsible for a very large majority of the crimes and the disasters. But we need to mobilize through desire, not in an individualistic, immediate gratification kind of move, but more in a kind of, well, what do we do to want to keep this life more alive? Because we are in a nefarious system. We are in a system that is actually bringing death, literally. So what do we do, and how do we actually bring people to want more life? And I think it's a really deep question.
Yes.
Year-old has just brought all her drawings that she's been doing.